Hercules and the Bureaucratic Labors. Boring Greek myth. Long after sunset, Olympus Inc. Dozes beneath its silent fluorescent glow. Marble floors gleam like still water, and the only sound is the soft hum of air conditioning settling into dreams of its own. Yet this isn't the start of a heroic saga brimming with battle cries. It's the after-hours login screen for history's most paperwork-heavy quest. Hercules, shoulders broad but posture careful, steps through the empty lobby clutching a beige orientation handbook thicker than any monster he has ever slain. The polished columns reflect his slow breath. Somewhere a printer clicks as if counting down to dawn. He reads his new title, Trainee, inked in glitter glue, and feels the first quiet ripple of a challenge unlike lions or hydras. These halls hold no roaring beasts, only color-coded forms waiting to multiply if handled without respect. So begins a softer labor. One demigod, a maze of cubicles, and the patient rustle of pages ready to test whether strength can lift a mountain of memos just as surely as it once raised the sky. Chapter 1. The Call to Paperwork. The fluorescent lights of Olympus Inc. hummed a monotonous tune, a counterpoint to the rhythmic thud of Hercules' size 17S on the polished marble floor. He wasn't used to this. He was used to the roar of battle, the clash of steel, the satisfying crunch of Nemean lion bone. This was different. This was orientation. His name tag, painstakingly crafted by a nervous-looking nymph with a penchant for glitter glue, read, Hercules, Trainee. The extra E was, he suspected, a deliberate insult. He'd considered demanding a corrected tag, but the form he'd need to fill out to request the correction involved at least 7 steps and 3 levels of managerial approval, a process he'd already witnessed unfold with agonizing slowness for a minor deity who'd requested a new stapler. The stapler had still not arrived. The orientation packet, a tome thicker than the Iliad and Odyssey combined, lay before him. Its cover, a sickly shade of beige, featured a picture of Zeus looking profoundly bored. Inside, the writing was a dizzying blend of legalese and divine pronouncements, punctuated by diagrams so convoluted they would make even the most seasoned architect weep. Hercules, renowned for his strength and his ability to slay multi-headed monsters, found himself utterly confounded. "Welcome to Olympus Inc., a voice chirped, shattering his concentration. He looked up to see a cherubic-looking Cupid, his quiver inexplicably filled with miniature staplers instead of arrows. "I'm Eros, your onboarding buddy. I'll guide you through the complexities of our unique employment procedures." Eros's explanation of the company's leave request form, for instance, involved a flowchart so intricate it charted the entire lineage of the gods from chaos onwards. Hercules learned, with a growing sense of dread, that requesting a day off to, say, wrestle a hydra required a detailed justification, photographic evidence of the hydra's demise, and a signed affidavit from at least 3 independent witnesses, all duly notarized by a certified Olympian notary public, currently on an extended sabbatical in the underworld. Eros informed him with a shrug. Their journey through the labyrinthine corridors of Olympus Inc. felt like a parody of his 12 labors, only instead of battling monsters, he was wrestling with forms, triplicate copies, and nonsensical acronyms. He witnessed a Gorgon turned to stone, not by his gaze, but by a particularly complicated benefits enrollment process. A Minotaur, normally a fearsome creature, was reduced to a whimpering mess, trapped in an endless loop of password resets. "Right," Eros continued, his voice slightly less cheerful than before. "Your first task is to deliver this memo to Hephaestus in the forge department." He handed Hercules a single sheet of paper, Its message composed in a font so small Hercules needed a magnifying glass and a PhD in ancient Greek to decipher it. It was, he discovered after much squinting, a request for new tongs. Specifically, a request for tongs that could withstand temperatures of at least 5,000 degrees Celsius, a fact that was further underscored by footnotes and sub-footnotes discussing various metallurgy techniques and the potential impact of various metallic alloys on divine efficiency. The seemingly simple task proved anything but. The journey to Hephaestus's forge involved navigating a series of confusing hallways, dodging disgruntled satyrs arguing over coffee machine temperature, and explaining to a grumpy Cyclops why it wasn't appropriate to use company stationery to carve his name into Mount Olympus. The forge department itself was a chaotic mess. Sparks flew, hammers clanged, and the air hung thick with the smell of sulfur and frustration. Hephaestus, a burly, soot-covered deity, barely glanced at the memo. He grunted something that Hercules couldn't understand, then tossed the memo back with a gesture that nearly dislodged Hercules' nose. "Needs more detail," Hephaestus grumbled, returning the memo with a series of additional requests, including a detailed cost analysis, a safety assessment, and approval from the Department of Fire Safety. Hercules returned to Eros, his face a mask of mounting despair. "This memo, it needs more... everything," he said, voice thick with frustration. Eros smiled sympathetically. "Welcome to Olympus Inc., he repeated, his voice now laced with a weary understanding. "It gets worse." The quest for the necessary information to satisfy Hephaestus's demands involved a journey across the entirety of Olympus. He consulted with an oracle, whose predictions mostly involved a long wait for a response and an endless stream of irrelevant data. A librarian, who'd lost his keys and most of the relevant records, and a team of accountants who were engaged in a heated argument about the proper depreciation rate of a mythical thunderbolt. Each individual Hercules spoke to sent him to another, creating a chain of bureaucratic delays and frustrations that extended into infinity. Hercules' legendary strength was no match against a mountain of paperwork. He found himself trapped in an endless loop of requests and revisions, each step further complicating his already insurmountable task. He began to understand the true nature of his new job. It was not about slaying monsters. It was about conquering mountains of paperwork. By the end of the day, Hercules found himself staring at a stack of forms taller than a minotaur and an almost unbearable migraine. His initial orientation had escalated into a full-blown administrative nightmare. He had learned many things that day. He had learned the true meaning of the word form. He had learned the power of procrastination in the face of impossible tasks. He had also learned the importance of a strong, caffeinated beverage, supplied after much effort by a sympathetic dryad who secretly ran a coffee cart in the basement. The next day began much like the last. More memos, more forms, more incomprehensible instructions. Hercules, a demigod accustomed to battles with monsters and giants, was now engaged in an epic struggle against the relentless tide of corporate bureaucracy. The quest for the perfect pair of tongs, initially a simple request, had grown into a saga of administrative woes, a mythical tale filled with more tedious paperwork than any hero should ever have to endure. He had a feeling that his 12 labors were merely the beginning, a very, very papery beginning. He sighed, picking up the new, even thicker orientation packet that had arrived that morning, marked Advanced Form Filing Techniques. His quest to obtain a single pair of tongs was, it seemed, only just beginning. The memo, crumpled and stained with Hephaestus's forge dust, lay accusingly on Hercules' desk. Needs more detail, Hephaestus had growled, a sound like rocks tumbling down a mountain. More detail? Hercules had already detailed the tong's required temperature resistance in a paragraph so exhaustive it could have doubled as a treatise on thermodynamics. He'd even included a detailed breakdown of the anticipated thermal expansion coefficient of various alloys. Still, it wasn't enough. His quest for the correct forms had begun. He'd first consulted the Olympus Inc. Employee Handbook, a weighty tome bound in what felt suspiciously like dragon hide. Within its pages, a labyrinthine index promised salvation, but delivered only more confusion. Cross-references led to dead ends. Footnotes spawned further footnotes, each leading down a rabbit hole of increasingly arcane regulations. It was a bureaucratic Bermuda Triangle, swallowing his sanity whole. His first stop was the Department of Interdepartmental Communications, a place that, ironically, couldn't seem to communicate effectively with itself. The department head, a grumpy nymph named Daphne, who, Hercules learned with a shudder, was also in charge of approving vacation time, initially refused to help. She claimed the forms he needed were classified, top secret, for the eyes of Zeus himself. Hercules, however, was not easily deterred. He flexed his biceps, inadvertently cracking the ancient oak desk, which earned him a rather sharp glare. "I'm Hercules!" he boomed, the sound echoing through the hushed office. "And I need those forms." This surprisingly worked. Daphne, seemingly unnerved by the potential for collateral damage, reluctantly produced a form titled Request for Interdepartmental Form Acquisition, itself requiring a form to fill out before the actual form request could even be initiated. This form demanded, among other things, a detailed justification for needing the forms, which, he discovered, could be interpreted as treason if not sufficiently detailed, the precise weight of the requested form in drachmas, and a sworn affidavit from 3 unrelated muses confirming his identity. Finding 3 unrelated muses who weren't currently engaged in some celestial karaoke session proved more difficult than taming Cerberus. The muses, when finally located amidst a rather raucous interpretive dance performance, required convincing. They demanded payment, not in gold or glory, but in complimentary tickets to a celestial ballet performance, the tickets themselves needing prior application, and a 5-page essay on the philosophy of divine choreography. The ballet tickets, alas, were currently out of stock. Hercules' quest for the right forms was starting to feel less like a quest and more like an elaborate scavenger hunt designed by the gods of tedium. Next, he needed a signature from the head of the Department of Divine Administration, a particularly officious dryad named Persephone. No relation to the queen of the underworld, she insisted with an air of barely contained superiority. Persephone, hidden away in an office that could only be accessed via a complicated series of puzzles and riddles, seemingly designed by a particularly sadistic sphinx, proved to be an even greater challenge than Daphne. Persephone demanded a meticulously organized spreadsheet detailing the past 5,000 years of Tong's usage in Olympus Inc. A task that would require, Hercules calculated, at least a millennium to complete. He'd spent hours trying to access the Olympus Inc. data archives only to discover that the password was Gorgonzola 3, a fact that only Eros, his perpetually stapler-wielding onboarding buddy, knew. And Eros, of course, was off attending a mandatory training session on the appropriate use of office supplies for interdepartmental communication. The irony was not lost on Hercules. The search for the correct forms led him on a winding path through the bureaucratic corridors of Olympus Inc. He encountered countless obstacles, confusingly labeled filing cabinets, malfunctioning fax machines that seemed to randomly transpose letters and numbers, and an endless stream of forms demanding forms demanding forms, an infinite regression into bureaucratic madness. He even narrowly avoided being turned into a paperweight by a particularly disgruntled Gorgon, whose frustration stemmed from a missing requisition form for her pet hydra's hair conditioner. The entire ordeal seemed a cosmic joke, a divine parody of human bureaucracy. Hercules, the slayer of monsters, was reduced to a trembling supplicant before the omnipotent power of the filing cabinet. His legendary strength felt utterly useless against the tyranny of triplicate copies and the infernal complexity of form filling. He considered unleashing his rage, transforming the office into a chaotic battlefield where filing cabinets would serve as shields and staplers as deadly weapons. But even that seemed futile. The paperwork would simply regenerate, growing exponentially with each strike. As the day wore on, Hercules' frustration mounted. He was surrounded by mountains of paperwork, each form a miniature Everest of bureaucratic torment. His heroic struggles against mythical beasts paled in comparison to the sheer terror of navigating this system. The simple request for tongs had become a Sisyphean task, a never-ending cycle of filling, signing, resubmitting, and endlessly waiting. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, by appealing to the ancient god's sense of humor through a carefully crafted 4-page letter describing his predicament and the absurdity of his situation, he secured a special expedited form approval signed by Zeus himself. Although it was clearly his signature, it did have a few coffee stains. He delivered the forms to Hephaestus, who, with a grunt of grudging approval and a muttered complaint about excessive documentation, finally agreed to start working on the tongs. This victory was hard won, a testament to his ability to navigate the overwhelming system of Olympus Inc. But Hercules knew this was merely one battle in a larger war against paperwork. He'd conquered a mythical beast, yes, but the true monster was still to be slain, the bureaucratic monster of Olympus Inc. He sighed. It seemed the 12 labors were truly just the beginning. The paperwork, it seemed, was infinite. The quest for the right forms was just starting to heat up. The newly acquired special expedited form approval felt less like a victory and more like a temporary reprieve. Hercules' triumph was short-lived, for lurking in the shadows of his accomplishment was a far greater beast, the complaints department. The air hung heavy with the scent of sulfur, unwashed linen, and a peculiar aroma that Hercules could only describe as permanently offended centaur. He found the complaints department nestled deep within the bowels of Olympus Inc., a cramped, stuffy room that seemed to have been designed specifically to induce claustrophobia. The walls were lined with filing cabinets overflowing with complaints, each meticulously labeled with a horrifyingly detailed description of the grievance. There was complaint regarding inadequate compensation for guiding lost tourists, complaint regarding excessive noise during the battle with the Hydra, and, alarmingly, complaint concerning the inappropriate use of a certain Stymphalian bird as a paperweight. The room itself was a chaotic tableau of mythical beings nursing grudges. A grumpy Cyclops grumbled about the collateral damage inflicted on his favorite boulder during Hercules' Nemean lion incident. A Hydra head, inexplicably detached and perched on a dusty shelf, incessantly hissed about the loss of its personal space during the multi-headed beast's demise. Even a Gorgon, a different one this time. Apparently, there was a surplus of disgruntled Gorgons in the Olympus Inc. workforce, armed with a mountain of paperwork and a truly terrifying amount of passive-aggressive energy, was filing a complaint about the excessive paperwork generated by her previous complaint. It was an infinite loop of paperwork-based misery. Hercules' usual method, brute force, proved utterly ineffective. His attempts to appease the Cyclops with an offer of a new, larger boulder only resulted in a complaint about the boulder's unsuitable texture. His attempt to soothe the Hydra head with apologies led to an hour-long monologue about the psychological trauma of decapitation, a complaint surprisingly substantiated by the Olympus Inc. Department of Mythological Trauma. As for the Gorgon, attempting to charm her into submission with flattery resulted in a new complaint about inappropriate advances from a muscular demigod, her paperwork now exponentially larger than before. He'd clearly stumbled into a bureaucratic version of a hydra, each complaint spawning two more. He tried reason, explaining that he was just trying to get some tongs made for Hephaestus, that his heroic labors were for the greater good, that he really, really needed those tongs. His words, however, were met with a wall of bureaucratic indifference, seasoned with a generous helping of mythical resentment. The minor gods and mythical creatures had no interest in his heroism. They were interested only in getting their grievances addressed. They viewed him not as a hero, but as a particularly inconsiderate, high-volume consumer of resources. Hercules, slayer of monsters, was now officially classified as a nuisance. A very, very muscular nuisance, but still a nuisance. In a moment of desperate inspiration, and possibly fueled by the lingering smell of sulfur, Hercules tried empathy. He sat down amongst them, listening to their tales of woe. The Cyclops lamented the loss of his favorite sunbathing spot, destroyed during the lion hunt. The Hydra head yearned for its lost family. The Gorgon railed against the complexities of the Olympus Inc. health insurance policy for multi-headed monsters. He discovered that each grievance was founded in something very, very real. It wasn't simply about the damage he had caused, but about the feeling of displacement, the frustration of the red tape involved in the compensation process, the difficulties faced in daily life with a newly singulated head. Hercules was taken aback. For the first time, he saw his actions not simply through the lens of the hero, but also through the lens of the displaced, the inconvenienced, the simply irritated. His heroic actions, while achieving their noble goals, had undeniably caused collateral damage to the lives and livelihoods of others. He wasn't just battling monsters, he was causing ripples of disruption throughout the entire ecosystem of Olympus. He began to understand the power and complexity of grievances. Armed with newfound empathy and a slight headache from listening to the Hydra head's extended complaints about the emotional cost of being a Hydra, Hercules decided on a new strategy. He offered concrete solutions, a new reinforced boulder for the Cyclops, a comprehensive grief counseling program for Hydra heads, including family reunions if logistically possible, and a simplification of the Olympian healthcare system, starting with clarifying the terms and conditions related to multi-headed creature coverage. The response was slow at first. The Cyclops remained skeptical, the Hydra head demanded further assurances, and the Gorgon continued to file complaint after complaint, each complaint more detailed than the last. But slowly Hercules' new approach began to bear fruit. The concrete solutions addressed the root of their grievances. He was not simply appeasing them, he was offering genuine solutions that reflected their real needs. The complaints department, once a fiery cauldron of resentment, slowly began to cool. Hercules, the slayer of monsters, had finally conquered a new foe, the power of empathetic problem-solving. It wasn't strength that won him this victory, but the understanding that heroism extended beyond brute force and into the realms of compassion and resolving complaints, something which he realized would possibly prove to be even more challenging than slaying a 100-headed Hydra. He had to deal with the paperwork associated with the new solutions, of course, but that, he realized, was merely another labor waiting in the wings. The 12 labors, he had now come to understand, was just the starting point of this paperwork odyssey. The next labor began with the creation of a form titled form for the resolution of complaints generated by the resolution of previous complaints. The bureaucracy of Olympus Inc., it seemed, was truly infinite. The special expedited form approval shimmered in Hercules's hand, a flimsy piece of papyrus that felt less like a victory certificate and more like a flimsy excuse for the impending deluge of paperwork. He'd conquered the complaints department, a feat arguably more Herculean than slaying the Nemean lion, but the true trial had only just begun, obtaining the actual permit to, well, to do whatever it was he was permitted to do. The specifics, unfortunately, remain shrouded in the usual Olympian bureaucratic fog. He ascended the endless flights of stairs leading to the permitting purgatory, a colossal edifice that seemed to defy the laws of physics and architecture. Columns spiraled into the clouds, adorned with incomprehensible carvings that might have depicted ancient regulations, or possibly just particularly intricate knotwork. The air hummed with the low thrum of frustrated immortals and the rhythmic clatter of countless quill pens scratching across parchment. The entrance was guarded by a pair of miniature Cerberus, their 3 heads buried in a mountain of forms. One head, apparently in charge of Form 37B application for permission to proceed with actions that might potentially cause minor inconvenience to lesser deities, snarled at Hercules, demanding to see his previous inconvenience-causing activity report, a document that, as far as Hercules could recall, didn't exist. Hercules, never one to shy away from a challenge or a ridiculously complex form, began navigating the labyrinthine corridors of the permitting purgatory. Each corridor was labeled with cryptic pronouncements like Zone of Moderately Significant Divine Intervention, Area of Potentially Hazardous Mythological Activity, and the particularly unsettling Sector Designated for the Handling of Complaints regarding the handling of complaints. The officials he encountered were less than helpful. One, a disgruntled satyr with a permanent frown and a quill perpetually stuck behind his ear, insisted Hercules needed a certificate of non-existent threat to the cosmic equilibrium, a document that seemed entirely redundant, considering he'd already dealt with the Nemean lion, the hydra, and an alarming number of disgruntled gorgons. Another, a harpy with a talent for bureaucratic obfuscation, insisted on reviewing Hercules' lineage for at least 7 generations, a task complicated by the fact that even Zeus seemed to have difficulty recalling his own family tree. The rules themselves were ludicrous. There were forms for forms, regulations for regulations, and an entire wing dedicated to the meticulous study of the proper alignment of punctuation marks on official documents. Hercules was required to submit a detailed risk assessment for each potential outcome of his request, including the probability of spontaneous combustion, the likelihood of unintended time travel, and the potential for attracting the attention of particularly grumpy titans. Each form required a unique, impossibly rare ink made from the tears of phoenixes. Apparently only juvenile phoenixes would do, a substance considerably harder to obtain than the golden fleece. The sheer volume of paperwork threatened to overwhelm even Hercules. He spent days wrestling with impossible riddles posed by self-aware questionnaires, battling his way through illogical cross-referencing protocols, and decoding cryptic bureaucratic symbols that bore a disturbing resemblance to ancient Sumerian curse tablets. He had to contend with the infuriatingly slow process of divine email, a system that involved carrier pigeons and often led to messages being lost in the turbulent winds of Olympus, a constant barrage of notifications about pending approvals, and the ever-present threat of a randomly generated audit by the Department of Interdimensional Regulatory Compliance. In moments of despair, Hercules found himself tempted to simply employ his brute strength to break down the entire permitting purgatory. But the thought of the avalanche of further paperwork that such an act would inevitably unleash, including Form 97B, request for repair of damage caused by unsanctioned use of excessive force in a government building, sobered him up. This, he realized, was not a battle to be won with fists, but with patience, cunning, and an almost superhuman capacity for endurance. Amidst the chaos, however, Hercules unexpectedly found an ally, a surprisingly cheerful nymph whose job was apparently to oversee the proper disposal of rejected forms, a task that had clearly driven her to a state of serene acceptance. Noticed his plight and offered him some sage advice. Bribery. Not blatant bribery, mind you, but a subtle offering of ambrosia and nectar to the right officials. A few strategically placed compliments. Your handwriting is remarkably legible for an immortal. Here and there, a heartfelt expression of admiration for a particularly ornate inkwell. The craftsmanship is truly exceptional. There, it was, Hercules reluctantly admitted, surprisingly effective. Through a combination of dogged perseverance, carefully administered flattery, and the judicious application of ambrosia, Hercules finally obtained his permit. It was stamped, signed, and countersigned in a kaleidoscope of official seals, an impressive document that could possibly have doubled as a miniature work of art, had it not been so utterly exhausting to obtain. He emerged from the permitting purgatory a changed man. His muscles ached, not from physical exertion, but from the sheer mental strain of navigating the bureaucratic maze. His spirit was weary, his eyes bloodshot from endless hours spent staring at forms. He had slain monsters, but he felt like he'd been wrestling with a particularly stubborn paper-based hydra. The permit in hand, he stared at it for a moment. He had conquered the paperwork of Olympus Inc. for now. He realized, with an almost painful clarity, that even the completion of this single permit would only lead to more paperwork. His journey of the 12 labors, he knew, had only just begun. The next labor awaited, a daunting task that loomed even larger than the Nemean lion. It was a labor that was to be called the filing of Form X27B, documentation of permit acquisition for the first labor. Hercules sighed, a sound as weary and ancient as Olympus itself. He knew, without a doubt, that his heroic journey had only just truly begun. The 12 labors, those were just the appetizers, a mere prelude to the main course of administrative purgatory that awaited. The gleaming chrome and glass of Olympus Inc.'s headquarters felt profoundly out of place. Hercules, still faintly smelling of ambrosia and bureaucratic desperation, sat rigidly in a minimalist chair that seemed designed to inflict maximum discomfort on its occupant. He clutched the newly acquired permit, a testament to his superhuman patience rather than his legendary strength, like a shield against the impending judgment. Before him sat Zeus, king of the gods, who currently looked more like a disgruntled middle manager than the ruler of Olympus. His thunderbolt lay discarded on his mahogany desk, replaced by a sleek silver pen that seemed to hum with barely contained power. Zeus tapped a stylus on a holographic projection, the ethereal image flickering between Hercules' heroic exploits, a stylized, almost cartoonish Nemean lion being effortlessly subdued, and a horrifyingly detailed spreadsheet charting Hercules' abysmal paperwork completion rate. The spreadsheet was a masterpiece of digital misery, a monument to red ink and missed deadlines. It listed every late form, every misplaced requisition, every instance of inappropriate use of divine intervention in administrative processes, which apparently covered a wide range of offenses, from accidentally incinerating a filing cabinet to using lightning to speed up the pigeon post. Hercules, Zeus began, his voice flat and devoid of any of the booming resonance Hercules had come to expect. Let's dispense with the pleasantries. Your performance review. Hercules swallowed hard. He'd faced down the Hydra, wrestled Cerberus, and navigated the bureaucratic labyrinth of the permitting purgatory. But this felt different. This was a battle of spreadsheets, not of swords. Sir, Hercules began, his voice a low rumble that shook the perfectly aligned pens in Zeus's penholder. I believe my performance has been exemplary. I mean, look at this permit. He proudly displayed the document, a sprawling testament to his tenacity. It was slightly singed in places where a rogue spark from a near-miss lightning strike had grazed the edges. Zeus raised an eyebrow, the holographic image zooming in on a minor smudge of what appeared to be phoenix tears on the document, indicating a slight overzealousness during the ambrosia-based diplomacy earlier on. Exemplary? Hercules, you managed to acquire the permit for your first labor, a feat I would credit as miraculous given the circumstances, only due to the intervention of a particularly clever nymph. However, let's discuss the timeline. While your completion rate for the lion itself was satisfactory, given that, it was dead, your submission of Form 47B post-Nemean lion capture risk assessment was not received until 3 weeks after the aforementioned lion's demise. Hercules shifted uncomfortably. 3 weeks was nothing compared to the centuries he'd spent battling various titans. And it did, admittedly, take some time to decipher the Form 47B's cryptic instructions. The form itself contained a riddle so complex that the Sphinx herself would have needed a second opinion. Sir, Hercules pleaded, the complexity of the forms, the sheer volume of paperwork, it's like battling a 1,000-headed hydra, but instead of heads, it has forms. Zeus sighed, a sound that could wilt the mythical lotus flower. He tapped his stylus, bringing up a graph depicting Hercules' performance against other Olympian employees. Hercules' data point was an outlier, a lonely speck far below the average. Compared to Persephone, Zeus pointed out, his voice dripping with disapproval, you're a complete disaster. Persephone managed to file her annual underworld harvest reports ahead of schedule, and even submitted a proposal for automating the Persephone's pomegranate picking process, saving the company an estimated 1,400 man-hours. Hercules mumbled something about the inherent difficulties of wrangling a multi-headed beast and the relative ease of organizing a harvest. He had the distinct impression that Zeus wasn't buying it. And then there's Hermes, Zeus continued, his tone laced with a mixture of exasperation and grudging respect. Hermes processed over 10,000 divine messages, streamlined the messenger pigeon protocol, and implemented a new system using enchanted carrier doves, all while maintaining a perfect attendance record. Hercules felt a bead of sweat trickle down his temple. He'd spent more time battling endless paperwork than actual monsters, and still couldn't beat the average performance of an Olympic mailman. He'd been fighting mythological beasts while Hermes was just delivering emails. Your time management is suboptimal, Zeus stated, summarizing the matter rather mildly. Your delegation skills are non-existent. Your communication with the interdepartmental committees is, well, let's just say that several complaints have been filed regarding the use of excessive force when dealing with recalcitrant filing clerks. And the incident with the automated filing system, let's not go there. Hercules was saved from responding by a sudden buzzing from Zeus's holographic interface. Another notification. It was probably another reminder about Form X27B for documenting permit acquisition for the first labor. Well, Hercules, Zeus said, finally putting down his stylus, I suppose you're not completely hopeless. You do possess superhuman strength and a remarkable capacity for enduring tedious paperwork. Given your Unique talents will keep you on. However, I strongly suggest that you take some courses in advanced bureaucratic navigation and perhaps conflict resolution without the use of divine intervention. And maybe, just maybe, look into investing in some better filing systems. Do you have any questions? Hercules, feeling profoundly defeated despite his previous victories, just shook his head. He did have a question, a million questions actually, regarding the nature of reality, the capriciousness of fate, and the soul-crushing weight of bureaucratic absurdity. But all that came out was a barely audible, "No, sir." The interview ended. Hercules lumbered out of the office, his shoulders slumped, carrying with him the weight of not just the 12 labors, but the added pressure of an alarmingly low performance review. The glittering city of Olympus was now firmly established in his mind as the equivalent of a soul-crushing corporate environment, and even with his legendary strength, he knew his real battle had only begun. He had to master Olympus Inc., or face the wrath of the gods, or at the very least another performance review. The thought itself was almost as daunting as facing the many-headed hydra. Almost. He still had to fill out his travel expense report. Chapter 2, The Augean Stables, A Cleaning Catastrophe. The shimmering doors of Olympus Inc.'s Department of Divine Sanitation hissed open, revealing a vista that dwarfed even the monstrous proportions of the Nemean lion. This wasn't a stable, it was a monument to administrative chaos. Towering stacks of parchment scrolls and what appeared to be millennia worth of lost receipts stretched towards a perpetually overcast ceiling. Dust motes thick as a summer's haze danced in the weak shafts of sunlight that penetrated the gloom. The air itself hung heavy with the cloying scent of aged papyrus and something vaguely resembling despair. Hercules, armed not with his club but with a meticulously crafted spreadsheet, a gift, ironically, from Hermes, who apparently found joy in optimizing even the most hellish of tasks, stared into the heart of the Augean stables. Or rather, the Augean filing system. It was less a stable and more a cataclysmic avalanche of paperwork, threatening to bury him under an avalanche of bureaucratic minutiae. His first labor, slaying the Nemean lion, had been child's play compared to this. At least then he'd faced a single, clearly defined adversary. This was a war against entropy, a battle waged on countless fronts, a struggle against an enemy that reproduced exponentially. Every document seemed to sprout new, equally labyrinthine forms, each requiring specific signatures, triplicate copies, and a baffling number of arcane stamps. He'd received a brief from Zeus detailing the task. Clean the Augean stables. Ensure compliance with all relevant regulations. Submit completed Form 666A post-cleaning sanitary assessment within 7 business days. Penalties for late submission include, but are not limited to, divine wrath, banishment to Tartarus, and an exceptionally low performance review. Hercules had stared at the form, a complex enigma that surpassed even the riddles of the Sphinx, until his eyes blurred. He imagined the Sphinx attempting to fill it out. She would have probably given up and gone back to posing riddles. He surveyed the scene. Piles of documents threatened to topple, creating precarious Jenga-like towers of paperwork. Each file was meticulously labeled in a style that resembled ancient cuneiform, yet sorting through it felt like navigating a poorly mapped dungeon. There were files labeled complaints from disgruntled satyrs regarding the quality of ambrosia, lost receipts for the purchase of enchanted cleaning supplies, and interdepartmental disputes regarding the allocation of divine funding for cleaning supplies. One mountain of paper was labeled Requests for additional funding for Augean Stables Cleaning Initiative, Years 1, 1000 BC. Hercules' eyes glazed over. He'd expected a monumental physical task, not a historical accounting project. He considered sending the entire mountain to the shredder, but he suspected that Zeus would raise objection based on historical preservation concerns. He attempted to tackle the mess logically. He began by sorting the documents by date, only to discover that the dates used a confusing system based on lunar cycles and the precise alignment of the stars. He then tried to organize them by subject matter, but the subjects themselves were so varied, overlapping, and often nonsensical that it was akin to classifying the species of cloud. He took a deep breath, attempting to bring his legendary patience to bear. He imagined himself as a titan of filing, a demigod of document management, a colossus of classification. He reminded himself that this was merely a test of his administrative prowess, a trial of his organizational skills. It was, in essence, the ultimate test of his ability to endure mind-numbing bureaucracy while facing the pressure of divine judgment. He spent hours sorting through the debris, meticulously noting down filing codes and trying to decipher ancient Greek bureaucratic jargon. He even located a document explaining the proper method for properly submitting a request for a new filing cabinet. A document itself requiring 3 supporting documents, each of which required 2 supporting documents, etc., creating an infinite loop of bureaucratic absurdity. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the immense office, Hercules had managed to reduce the monstrous piles of paperwork by only a minuscule amount. He surveyed his surroundings. He felt less like a hero and more like a worker ant facing an unending mountain of sugar. He imagined all the forms he'd have to fill out upon completion of this task, the lengthy reports he'd need to compile. The thought was almost as daunting as slaying a hydra. Almost. He still needed to deal with that incident report regarding the accidental incineration of the Olympus Inc. Coffee machine. The coffee machine incident wasn't even related to the Augean stables cleaning, but paperwork, like the hydra, had a habit of multiplying its heads. He sighed. The sheer volume of paperwork would bury him, and probably all of Olympus, before he could reach the end of this task. His only solace was that Hermes, with his newfound efficiency of enchanted doves, would probably be able to deliver all this paperwork to Zeus with speed. The thought of the ensuing performance review, however, was not so comforting. He suddenly understood the allure of being banished to Tartarus. At least, there was a chance of less paperwork down there. The next day began in much the same way. Hercules still battling against a seemingly endless amount of paperwork, his divine strength useless against the sharp edges of countless forms and regulations. He considered applying for a transfer to the Department of Divine Warfare. At least there, the monsters didn't require quite so much paperwork. Or did they? He'd just need to submit Form 14A, Monster Slaying Incident Report, for each and every one of them. He buried his face in his hands, overwhelmed by the sheer absurdity of it all. Maybe Persephone was right about automating everything. Just as Hercules was contemplating the merits of a career change, perhaps becoming a lyre player or a professional napping consultant, the earth trembled. Not a heroic tremor, mind you, more like a disgruntled groan from a particularly overweight filing cabinet. Then, a chilling voice, resonant as 1,000 screaming harpies, boomed through the Augean stables. "Hercules, son of Zeus," the voice reverberated, echoing off the towering stacks of parchment. "Prepare yourself for an audit." The air grew colder, the dust motes swirling into miniature whirlwinds of terror. From the shadows emerged a figure, draped in a surprisingly stylish, albeit slightly scorched, business suit. It was Hades, lord of the underworld, looking remarkably like a disgruntled accountant who'd had one too many Stygian espressos. He carried a clipboard, its surface gleaming ominously under the dim light. It was filled with forms that made Hercules's Form 666 A looked like a child's crayon drawing. These forms were written in a language that seemed to combine ancient Sumerian with modern accounting jargon. Hercules suspected that even the Sphinx would struggle to decode them. "I have received complaints," Hades announced, his voice dripping with the icy disdain of a department manager scrutinizing a late expense report regarding the thoroughness of your cleaning efforts. "Apparently, some minor discrepancies have been noted. A few oversights." Hades tapped a skeletal finger on the clipboard. "The discrepancy regarding the missing Karen's ferry receipt, for instance, and the questionable use of Cerberus's kibble as cleaning supplies, not to mention the apparent lack of a proper risk assessment for handling the three-headed dog's drool. Frankly, Hercules, your paperwork is a disaster." Hercules felt his already depleted heroic aura deflate further. He had faced the Nemean lion, the hydra, and even a particularly stubborn bureaucracy, but this was a different beast entirely. An audit from Hades was not something to be trifled with. The very air around Hades radiated a palpable sense of doom, mixed with the lingering scent of sulfur and brimstone. But I've been working tirelessly," Hercules stammered, pointing to the minuscule dent he'd made in the mountain of paperwork. "I've been meticulously documenting every cleaning action." Hades raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow, a gesture that suggested centuries of experience in dealing with incompetent subordinates. "Meticulous? Hercules, my dear boy, meticulous doesn't involve using a charred piece of papyrus as a bookmark, nor does it include filing complaints from disgruntled minotaurs under the miscellaneous expenses category." Hades proceeded to meticulously examine every single document within reach, his long, bony fingers moving with unnerving speed. He flipped through pages with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent eternity navigating the labyrinthine paperwork of the underworld. He found discrepancies everywhere. Missing signatures, incorrect dates, all those lunar cycles and star alignments were proving disastrous, and a general lack of what he termed auditable coherence. Each discovery was met with a sigh that could freeze the river Styx. He even found a misplaced receipt for a single ambrosia cookie, purchased ages ago for a particularly hard-working Cerberus. Hades looked at Hercules with a severe expression. "This, Hercules," he said, his voice ringing with the authority of someone who could summon an army of the damned at a moment's notice, "is evidence of gross fiscal mismanagement. You have not properly accounted for that ambrosia cookie. Therefore, a further investigation will be required. This will be filed under financial irregularities related to canine snack acquisition. Form 1099 Hades is now required." Hercules, overwhelmed by this sudden onslaught of bureaucratic hellfire, could only stare blankly at the increasingly complicated forms piled high on Hades's clipboard. He realized that facing a 100-headed hydra was less daunting than facing Hades's audit. At least the hydra's heads only needed chopping. These forms required a level of excruciating detail that would make even the most meticulous of scribes weep. As Hades continued his audit, his pronouncements echoed through the cavernous office. Insufficient justification for the use of enchanted sponges. The cost of Stygian seaweed, while justified, lacks proper itemized detail. Unacceptable use of a Pegasus feather duster, no proof of environmental friendliness. Hercules felt his already strained patience reach its breaking point. He was a hero, a demigod. He'd faced monsters beyond imagining, cleaned the stables of Augeas multiple times by the looks of this seemingly never-ending pile of paperwork. And yet, he was being reduced to a quivering mass of anxiety by a meticulous audit from the Lord of the Dead. Hades, however, seemed thoroughly engrossed in his task. He examined Hercules' spreadsheets with a magnifying glass, his skeletal fingers tracing the rows and columns with terrifying precision. He discovered that Hercules had accidentally miscalculated the number of stray souls accidentally swept up in the cleaning process. This resulted in another 27 forms being produced. Each required 2 witnesses. One of the witnesses was a particularly grumpy shade who refused to sign anything unless offered ambrosia. The sun set, casting long, ominous shadows across the Augean stables. Hercules, exhausted, defeated, and covered in dust and despair, watched as Hades meticulously checked his filing system for the 100th time, noting down every minor discrepancy with an unsettling amount of glee. Even the air seemed heavy with the threat of divine or infernal retribution. The thought of the performance review, which would be conducted jointly by Zeus and Hades, threatened to make Hercules wish he'd actually stayed in Tartarus. At least there they seemed to have a more streamlined approach to paperwork. Or did they? Probably many more forms to fill out there as well. He sighed. He truly was in an inescapable paperwork loop of bureaucratic hell. The end of the audit was nowhere in sight. Maybe he could sneak off and become that professional napping consultant after all. The audit finally concluded, or rather, Hades declared it concluded. A declaration met with a sigh that could wilt a field of asphodel. He left Hercules with a mountain of revised forms, a stern warning about the importance of proper expense reporting, especially regarding ambrosia cookies, and a lingering sense of dread that rivaled the chilling winds of the Stygian plains. Hercules, however, had a new problem. He needed to copy the revised forms. His own equipment, a rickety contraption powered by harnessed lightning and fueled by sheer willpower, had long since given up the ghost, a sacrifice to the insatiable appetite of Hades' audit. He needed a better solution, a faster, more reliable method of duplication. This, he realized, lay with the centaurs. The centaur office supply company, Hooves and Hues, was notorious. Their copy machines were legendary, whispered to be capable of replicating documents at the speed of thought, capable of printing on papyrus, parchment, and even the toughest hides of mythical beasts. The problem wasn't their technological prowess, but rather their legendary negotiation tactics. Centaurs were notoriously shrewd businessmen, masters of bureaucratic obfuscation, and possessed a penchant for riddles and word games that would leave even the Sphinx scratching its head. Hercules, armed with his revised forms and a slightly bruised ego, approached the Hooves and Hues headquarters. The building was a curious blend of ancient Greek architecture and modern office design. Columns adorned with intricate carvings supported a glass and steel structure that housed what appeared to be a state-of-the-art print shop. Inside, centaurs in crisp business suits bustled about, their equine halves occasionally getting tangled in the wiring. The air thrummed with the hum of high-tech machinery and the clatter of hooves on polished floors. He was greeted by Chiron, the head of the department, a centaur who wore his tailored suit with the air of a seasoned corporate raider. Chiron looked at Hercules' pile of forms with the detached amusement of a stockbroker contemplating a penny stock. So, the son of Zeus himself, Chiron mused, his voice a low rumble, seeking the aid of our humble copy services. Interesting, but tell me, hero, what kind of bargain do you offer in exchange for our unparalleled efficiency? Hercules hesitated. He'd faced down giants and monsters, but negotiating with a centaur businessman was proving far more challenging. Well, he began, I offer my services. I can, clean your stables. They appear to be in need of attention. Chiron chuckled, a sound like rocks tumbling down a mountainside. Hercules, my dear boy, our stables are cleaned by automated self-replicating cleaning bots programmed with the most advanced algorithms. We have never had to deal with the old-fashioned method. We have advanced beyond your time, my friend. Hercules' face fell. This was going to be harder than anticipated. He tried again. I could I could slay a few particularly troublesome paperwork generating griffins for you. They've been causing havoc with your filing system. Chiron shook his head. Griffins? We handle those with automated drone strikes and very advanced paper shredders. Far more efficient. The negotiation continued for hours. Hercules offered to retrieve lost magical pens from the depths of Tartarus. He proposed a barter system involving various rare herbs and enchanted gemstones. He even attempted to charm Chiron with a lyre performance, a rather disastrous attempt that sent several nearby printers offline due to the excessive vibrations. Nothing worked. The centaurs, it turned out, were not interested in traditional heroics. Their currency was efficiency. They lived and breathed in the world of spreadsheets, project management software, and quarterly reports. Their demands were precise. Their contracts filled with legalese that would make a lawyer's eyes water. They demanded a detailed breakdown of Hercules' cleaning schedule, a risk assessment for every form being copied, and a full environmental impact statement for the paper usage. Hercules, utterly frustrated, spent the next several days wrestling with centaur bureaucracy. He learned about synergistic workflow optimization and cross-functional team integration. He filled out forms explaining his cleaning methodology, his previous experience with other mythological creatures, and his projected timelines for each project, all while fighting off attempts by overly enthusiastic office cleaning bots to organize his paperwork. Finally, after a marathon negotiation session that involved more complicated spreadsheets than Hades's audit, a compromise was reached. Hercules agreed to write a comprehensive case study on the benefits of his cleaning methods, focusing on their adaptability to high-pressure, mythical workplaces. In return, the centaurs agreed to provide him with unlimited access to their copy machines, along with comprehensive training on their operation and maintenance. Hercules, exhausted but triumphant, finally had his copies. He left the Hooves and Hues headquarters with a renewed sense of appreciation for the power of bureaucratic compliance. As he walked away, he could almost hear the faint clatter of hooves and the whirring of advanced printer machinery, a harmonious symphony of office efficiency. He wondered if maybe, just maybe, a career in consulting was in order. The pay, though, seemed even less than that of a hero. He sighed, thinking about all that leftover paperwork that Hades might send his way. The professional napping consultant idea felt increasingly appealing. Maybe he could even write a case study on that too. The possibilities seemed endless. The paperwork, however, a bit less so. He really should try and improve his systems. But first, a nap. The hero definitely deserved a nap. Having finally secured the means to reproduce his revised forms from the notoriously efficient and slightly terrifying Centaur Office Supply Company, Hercules faced a new challenge: digitization. Hades, ever the stickler for detail, had specified that the submitted forms must be in digital format. Hercules, accustomed to chiseling decrees onto stone tablets, found himself staring at a sleek chrome-plated laptop, a device that seemed to hum with an unnerving intelligence. His initial attempts were less than successful. He tried to simply scan the forms, a process that involved wrestling with a scanner that seemed determined to jam at the most inconvenient moments. The scanner, a state-of-the-art model boasting an array of incomprehensible features, proved to be as temperamental as a Cerberus with a stomachache. It refused to cooperate with anything less than perfectly flat documents, a challenge when dealing with forms that had been slightly singed by a particularly enthusiastic encounter with a three-headed dog. Hercules' attempts to flatten the forms resulted in a small-scale paper-related disaster. He tried pressing them with various items: his club, a surprisingly heavy pomegranate, even a captured hydra's head, which proved less effective than anticipated, largely because the hydra head kept trying to bite the papers. The resulting creases and tears only seemed to amplify the scanner's reluctance to cooperate. He eventually resorted to using a combination of smooth river stones and strategically placed ambrosia cookies. Hades's warning about expense reporting was, perhaps, less relevant than he thought. Even when he managed to get a few forms through the scanner, the resulting digital files seemed to be cursed. The files were either corrupted, inexplicably altered, or vanished entirely into the digital ether. He received error messages that would rival the pronouncements of the Oracle of Delphi in their cryptic obscurity. Terms like undefined variable, null pointer exception, and segmentation fault sent him spiraling into a state of frustrated confusion. He felt as though he was battling not just a malfunctioning machine, but a malevolent digital entity actively working against him. His attempts to seek assistance resulted in equally disastrous encounters. The tech support line, a toll-free number that led him on a labyrinthine phone tree worthy of the Minotaur's lair, yielded only an automated voice that spoke in riddles and offered no concrete solutions. He tried explaining his problems to various IT specialists, who mostly reacted with a mixture of bewilderment and concern. The specialists, all dressed in inexplicably bright neon shirts, treated him like a particularly confused client, rather than the son of Zeus. Hercules, ever resourceful, attempted to use his brute strength to resolve the issue. He tried restarting the laptop by literally throwing it in the air and catching it. Not recommended. He attempted to physically unplug the problematic scanner, resulting in a shower of sparks that briefly illuminated the room in an eerie strobe light effect. He even tried feeding the computer ambrosia, convinced that even digital systems could appreciate a well-prepared snack. They did not. His methods were less than successful. The digital Augean stables, it seemed, were even more challenging to clean than their physical counterpart. The sheer volume of digital data, a seemingly endless stream of corrupted files, incomplete records, and duplicate entries threatened to overwhelm him. He found himself trapped in a nightmarish cycle of system crashes, data recovery attempts, and near-constant struggles against recalcitrant software. Each attempt to organize the digital files seemed to create new problems. He tried using various programs, from ancient text-based editors he accidentally dug up in the Library of Alexandria, to modern-day spreadsheet programs that seemed to have their own complex syntax. The spreadsheets, with their cryptic formulas and the endless columns, felt like a digital labyrinth from which there was no escape. They were more challenging to navigate than the underworld itself. In his frustration, Hercules inadvertently discovered the joys of copy-paste. The sheer simplicity of the method shocked him. He began to understand the seemingly limitless power of the digital world. He felt as though he was finally wielding a weapon as powerful as his club, but this weapon was less prone to breaking or needing to be sharpened. He made rapid progress. However, his joy was short-lived. The system crashed again, and this time the autosave feature, his saving grace, had failed. He was left staring at a blank screen. The fruits of hours of painstaking effort vanished into the void. He considered his options. He could simply give up and submit the incomplete files, hoping that Hades would be merciful. He could go on another mythological creature-wrangling quest for better equipment or software. Or he could take a nap. The nap felt increasingly attractive. It was a very appealing option. He could even write a case study on the effectiveness of napping, focusing on its application to high-pressure, mythologically intense data entry situations. That would definitely impress the centaurs and the spreadsheet gods. The hero deserved a nap. As Hercules sank into a deep, well-deserved slumber, he dreamt of perfectly organized spreadsheets, flawlessly scanned documents, and error messages that were actually helpful. He dreamt of the day when technology would assist him instead of actively working against him. It was a dream filled with the promise of perfectly streamlined workflows and automated systems that would let him get his paperwork done quickly so he could spend more time napping. A dream worth chasing, even if it involved more paperwork. But for now, it was a nap. A very, very necessary nap. He had so much paperwork. But first, the nap. The nap was imperative. He really, really deserved the nap. Awakening from his restorative nap, Hercules felt a renewed sense of purpose, though the lingering scent of ambrosia cookies still clung to his beard. The blank screen of his laptop stared back at him, a silent testament to his previous digital debacle. However, the memory of the copy-paste function, that glorious time-saving miracle, burned brightly in his mind. He approached the task with a newfound determination, a grit born not of brute strength, but of sheer desperate need to avoid further mythical paperwork-related calamities. He started by meticulously organizing his remaining physical forms. He'd learned a valuable lesson about the importance of pre-scanning organization, a lesson he'd etched into a stone tablet for posterity, and because he didn't trust digital backups. He arranged the documents with military precision, creating neat piles based on form type and date. This was, after all, still a Herculean task, even if it lacked the thrilling spectacle of wrestling a multi-headed beast. He hummed a jaunty tune, a surprisingly upbeat rendition of a funeral dirge he'd learned from a particularly morose satyr. It somehow seemed fitting. The scanning process proceeded with remarkable smoothness, a testament to his improved technique and a newfound respect for the fragility of paper. He'd even managed to train himself to coax the scanner into cooperation using a low-level hum of appeasement. It responded well to the rhythmic drone, much like a particularly docile gorgon might be calmed by a carefully played lyre. He considered writing a scholarly paper on the application of acoustics to office equipment, but he decided that might be even more paperwork. Digital organization was the next hurdle. He embraced the power of the spreadsheet, transforming the once daunting program into his ally. He discovered the magic of color coding, categorizing each form by its urgency, completion status, and level of Hades-induced terror. He even added a column for potential divine intervention required, just in case he needed to call in a favor from Zeus, who, it turned out, had a surprisingly efficient email system. The sheer volume of data, however, remained a challenge. Each form required numerous fields to be filled, each field demanding excruciating attention to detail. He had to ensure that every I was dotted, every T was crossed, and every semicolon was perfectly placed. He even discovered the intricate art of hyperlinking, a skill that he found surprisingly exhilarating. Linking one form to another with the grace of a seasoned web developer was an unexpected source of joy. As he worked, his initial frustration slowly transformed into a peculiar kind of focus. The hum of the computer became a rhythmic backdrop to his tireless efforts, and the clicking of his keyboard created a soothing percussive beat. It became a meditative experience, akin to the rhythmic chopping of wood or the repetitive striking of a blacksmith's hammer, only with more spreadsheets. He found himself entering a state of flow, a productive trance where time seemed to melt away. He powered through form after form, each one a small victory in a larger bureaucratic war. His fingers flew across the keyboard with the dexterity of a centaur playing the lyre, the speed of a harpy weaving a web of deceit. But in this case, the deceit was purely for organizational purposes. The process wasn't without its hiccups. The system crashed once more, sending a shiver of icy dread down his spine. But this time the autosave function, like a loyal Cerberus guarding his digital treasure, had done its duty. His progress was preserved. The digital gods had spared him. The final report took shape, a document of impressive length and complexity, meticulously formatted and flawlessly organized. It was a testament to his persistence, his adaptability, and his newfound mastery of digital bureaucracy. He reviewed it one last time, checking for typos, ensuring that each comma was in its rightful place, each decimal point perfectly aligned. It was, he admitted to himself, a beautiful thing. Submitting the report was an anticlimactic moment. He hit the send button, watching the progress bar crawl across the screen. There was no triumphant fanfare, no chorus of cheering muses, just the quiet satisfaction of a job well done, a bureaucratic Everest conquered, not with brute strength, but with careful planning, a dash of divine intervention, and a generous supply of ambrosia cookies. He leaned back in his chair, feeling an unexpected surge of pride. It wasn't slaying a hydra or cleaning the Augean stables, but it was something that required a level of patience, persistence, and attention to detail that even a god would respect. He might not have received a hero's welcome, but he did receive a confirmation email, a digital laurel wreath bestowed upon him by the ethereal hand of Hades himself. The email even mentioned potential future employment opportunities in the Underworld's administrative department. As he logged off, a quiet sense of victory settled over him. The digital Augean stables had been conquered, not by brute force, but by sheer dogged determination and a surprisingly effective use of the copy-paste function. The report was in. The deadline was met, and Hercules surprisingly had some free time. Free time he could use for napping. He deserved it. He deserved a very long nap. A nap filled with dreams of perfectly organized spreadsheets, efficiently functioning scanners, and helpful error messages. Yes, a nap was precisely what the hero needed. The very thought was heroic in itself. The paperwork was done. The nap could begin. His muscles relaxed. His eyes drooped. The nap was finally his. The nap was calling. He was going to nap. He was going to nap very, very well. Indeed, he would nap heroically. The nap, after all, was a worthy reward for his monumental, if somewhat less than epic, achievement. Chapter 3. The Hydra's Head Count. Headache. The ambrosia-induced nap had done little to prepare Hercules for the sheer, overwhelming terror that was the Hydra's HR file. It wasn't just one monstrous file. It was a hydra-headed monstrosity of its own, a chaotic tangle of forms, applications, performance reviews, and bizarrely specific dietary requests. Apparently, one head had a severe aversion to ambrosia, preferring only the finest fermented swamp reeds. Olympus Inc's HR department, a sprawling labyrinth of beige cubicles and perpetually malfunctioning coffee machines, was not ready for this. He'd received a terse email, all caps, naturally, from Persephone herself, the head of HR, and, incidentally, the queen of the underworld, a fact that added a certain chilling weight to her communications. The subject line read, Hydra Headcount Crisis, Immediate Action Required. The email was accompanied by a digital folder containing what felt like a terabyte of data. A terabyte of pure, unadulterated HR nightmare fuel. Hercules opened the first file, a seemingly straightforward employee onboarding form. However, the form predictably sprouted into a Hydra-like series of subforms, each requiring information specific to a particular head. Head 1, it seemed, preferred to be addressed as Sir Reginald III, and had a particular fondness for medieval calligraphy. Head 7, on the other hand, only communicated through interpretive dance, with his requests for vacation time rendered in a series of elaborate pirouettes and dramatic leaps. The diversity training documents were even more unsettling. Each head, it appeared, had its own unique set of prejudices and biases. One head harbored a deep-seated hatred of centaurs, another was fiercely allergic to laughter, and yet another insisted on mandatory weekly interpretive dance sessions, regardless of employee skill level. Trying to navigate these conflicting personalities and ensure compliance with Olympus Inc. As ludicrously complex diversity guidelines felt like trying to herd a flock of satyrs through a minefield. Hercules spent the next several hours wrestling not with monsters, but with spreadsheets. He tried to color code the heads' personalities, plotting their individual quirks and preferences onto a meticulously crafted chart that resembled a particularly complicated astrological map. He discovered that Head 5 had a penchant for filing frivolous grievances, often against Head 2 for excessive tail wagging during mandatory meetings. He even found a grievance filed against Zeus himself, accusing the head god of insufficiently sparkly lightning during the recent employee appreciation picnic. The complexity of the situation was only compounded by the fact that several heads seemed to have developed multiple personalities. Head 3, for example, identified as both a passionate flamenco dancer and a certified accountant, which led to some rather bizarre discrepancies in his expense reports. One entry claimed reimbursement for a vital flamenco-inspired team-building exercise involving artisanal cheese and several kilos of castanets. The process of verifying the Hydra's employment history proved equally challenging. The Hydra, it turned out, had a rather spotty employment record, with several gaps in its resume conveniently coinciding with various incidents of, shall we say, minor property damage, and unauthorized incineration of several Olympic-level athletes. And then there were the benefits forms. Each head required a separate benefits package, customized to their unique needs and proclivities. Head 9, a noted devotee of the arts, demanded full coverage for its extensive collection of rare and exotic poisonous flowers. Head 6, a self-proclaimed oracle, requested a comprehensive psychic benefits package, including regular tarot card readings and a monthly allowance for communicating with deceased Roman emperors. As Hercules struggled to make sense of the HR chaos, he began to see the Hydra not as a fearsome monster, but as a symptom of a much larger problem: the dysfunctional nature of Olympus Inc. SHR department. The system was archaic, inefficient, and utterly unprepared for dealing with the complexities of managing a multi-headed beast, let alone its various demands, feuds, and personality quirks. The entire situation highlighted the absurdity of modern workplace bureaucracy. The sheer volume of forms, the endless meetings, the convoluted policies, it all felt strangely familiar, even if the employee in question was a multi-headed monster who occasionally breathed fire. He started to feel a sense of camaraderie with the beleaguered HR staff, struggling against the tide of paperwork and the whims of a capricious pantheon of gods. The final straw came when he attempted to process a head's request for a spiritual retreat to a secluded volcanic island. The request included a detailed itinerary outlining the specific types of lava flows preferred for meditation, the optimal volcanic rock formations for shamanic rituals, and the need for a personal volcano-themed masseuse. This request was accompanied by a lengthy essay titled "The Ontological Implications of Volcanic Ash on Personal Well-Being," written, apparently, by the head itself. Hercules stared at the screen, contemplating the vast ocean of paperwork stretching before him. This was more than just a job. This was a test of his endurance, his sanity, and possibly his ability to withstand the existential dread of dealing with Olympus Inc. SHR department. The 12 labors seemed almost quaint now, a simple task in comparison to the Hydra's HR file. He took a deep breath, grabbed another ambrosia cookie, this time making sure to check for swamp reed allergies, and dove back into the chaotic labyrinth of spreadsheets and eccentric demands. The hero needed a break, and then some more paperwork. Then some more after that. The Hydra's HR department was, after all, never-ending, and so was the paperwork. The never-ending paperwork. The paperwork, the paperwork, the paperwork. Hercules groaned. The ambrosia cookie crumbled into dust in Hercules' hand, a fitting metaphor for his dwindling hope. He stared across the mahogany table at the assembled Olympians, their faces etched with a mixture of boredom and barely concealed irritation. The air hung heavy with the scent of stale coffee and impending doom. Or perhaps that was just the lingering sulfurous odor from the Hydra's recent team-building exercise, more accurately described as a volcanic eruption in the employee break room. This wasn't the arena, nor the Nemean forest. This was a dimly lit budget meeting room smelling faintly of desperation and old paperwork. And the monster he faced wasn't a fire-breathing beast, but a budget proposal that would make Medusa's gaze seem positively cheerful. The document, presented by Hermes, the budget messenger and self-proclaimed god of speed, a claim constantly challenged by his chronic lateness, was a monstrous thing, pages thick with cryptic calculations, baffling justifications, and frankly scandalous expense reports. It began innocently enough: request for funds, Hydra Department. Then the madness unfolded. The first line item nearly choked Hercules on his lukewarm ambrosia. Item 1, annual stipend for Head 7's interpretive dance therapy sessions, 500,000 golden drachmas. Hercules, a man accustomed to slaying lions and cleaning Augean stables, could barely comprehend such extravagance. 500,000 drachmas? He exclaimed, his voice echoing in the cavernous room. For interpretive dance? Hermes, fidgeting with a golden stylus, offered a weak defense. Well, you see, Head 7 expresses its professional frustrations through interpretive dance. Apparently, it needs a higher budget for increased interpretive expressiveness. It's therapeutic. Zeus, the king of the gods and self-proclaimed expert on employee motivation, mostly through fear, grunted his approval. Sounds efficient, he mumbled, clearly distracted by a particularly sparkly cloud formation outside the window. Next came the requests for advanced swamp reed procurement, Head 1's dietary needs, a comprehensive course in advanced medieval calligraphy, Head 3 again, and a substantial budget allocation for repairs to employee break room, resulting from unforeseen volcanic activity. Hercules began to suspect the team-building exercise had been slightly misrepresented. Then came the truly bizarre requests: an item for emergency philosopher recruitment to provide existential guidance to Head 9, who was apparently experiencing an identity crisis, and another for reimbursement for emergency transport of a kidnapped Sphinx. Head 6 was apparently deeply offended by the Sphinx's refusal to participate in the interpretive dance sessions. The requests were relentless, each more ludicrous than the last. There was funding for an experimental bioluminescent moss farm to improve workplace ambience, Head 2's request. They evidently believed the dim lighting contributed to their low morale. And then there was the matter of the artisanally crafted, lava-themed massage table for Head 5's volcanic stress relief therapy. Hera, Queen of the Gods and head of the Divine Intervention Department, she apparently oversaw all miraculous interventions within Olympus Inc., was livid. "This is outrageous!" she shrieked, her voice echoing across the room. "They're spending more on swamp reeds than on ambrosia for the entire pantheon. The budget is a bottomless pit, a hydra of expenses." The irony wasn't lost on Hercules. The very creature he was supposed to be managing was bankrupting Olympus Inc. His heroic labors were now offset by the endless streams of requests and the constant struggle to keep the Hydra's budget in check. He felt a deep sense of solidarity with the poor souls in Olympus Inc.'s accounts department. They were clearly facing an equally formidable foe, albeit a less fire-breathing one. The meeting devolved into chaos. Arguments erupted, Accusations were hurled, and several divine beings came perilously close to fisticuffs. Hercules, caught in the whirlwind of budget battles, found himself frantically calculating, negotiating, and desperately trying to reconcile the wildly disparate needs and wants of a multi-headed monster with a penchant for interpretive dance and expensive swamp reeds. He proposed a compromise, a slightly reduced budget for the interpretive dance therapy. After all, even interpretive dance has its limits. A strict quota for the swamp reeds, with a mandatory taste test conducted by Zeus, and the absolute banning of all future volcanic team building exercises. He even attempted to renegotiate the expense for the kidnapped Sphinx, arguing that it could have been safely borrowed instead of kidnapped, but to no avail. Head 6, it turned out, was remarkably insistent on the correct legal terminology. The final budget, a compromise of sorts, was still a monstrous document. Hercules sighed, feeling the weight of the Olympian budget crisis crush upon him. He'd slain monsters, navigated labyrinths, and cleaned impossibly filthy stables. But wrestling with the Hydra's budget was a new kind of hell, a bureaucratic, paperwork-laden hell, filled with interpretive dance, swamp reeds, and the lingering scent of sulfur. And yet he couldn't help but find a certain perverse amusement in it all. After all, what better way to experience the trials and tribulations of corporate life than battling a budget-busting, fire-breathing, interpretive, dance-loving, swamp reed-obsessed, Sphinx-kidnapping Hydra? He might have been a hero, but today he was just another weary warrior in the unending battles of Olympus Inc.'s finance department. And the paperwork he knew would never end. Never. Ever. The thought filled him with a quiet, despairing dread that only a hero could truly understand. And then, the faint smell of burning swamp reeds drifted in from the corridor. The battle, it seemed, was far from over. The faint scent of burning swamp reeds, a recurring olfactory assault in recent weeks, was quickly superseded by the aroma of overripe nectarines and simmering resentment. Hercules stood before a long, polished table in what could only be described as Olympus Inc.'s most aggressively beige conference room. He wasn't facing a fearsome beast this time, but a committee. A very, very scaly committee. 7 pairs of intensely focused reptilian eyes glared at him from across the table. These weren't the casually arsonist heads of the Hydra he'd battled earlier. These were the representatives of the Hydra Workers' Union, Local 666, and they meant business. Or at least as much business as a creature with multiple heads and a history of spontaneously combusting could mean. The Union representative, Head 3, a surprisingly articulate individual, considering its penchant for medieval calligraphy, cleared its throat, a sound like rocks tumbling down a hillside. "Hercules," it began, its voice a low, gravelly rumble. "We've called this meeting to address several serious grievances regarding our working conditions here at Olympus Inc." Hercules braced himself. He'd faced Cerberus, the multi-headed hound of Hades, and managed to negotiate a slightly improved kibble ration. But this felt different. This was HR on a scale previously unimagined. Firstly, Head 3 continued, unfurling a scroll that looked suspiciously like a particularly elaborate grocery list, the issue of adequate break times. Currently, we receive a mere 15 minutes for lunch, and that's hardly sufficient for 11 heads to partake in a civilized meal. We propose a minimum of 30 minutes with complimentary ambrosia and a choice of 3 different swamp reed varieties. Hercules blinked. This wasn't quite the health and safety concerns he'd anticipated. Swamp reed variety? We've already discussed the budget allocated for swamp reed procurement. Indeed, chimed in Head 1, its voice unexpectedly high-pitched. But the current selection lacks diversity. We demand more organic options, locally sourced, and preferably grown under a full moon. Think of the morale boost. Head 5, whose lava-themed massage table was still a fresh source of contention, grumbled about the lack of adequate ergonomic support for its particular neck posture. "These heads aren't meant for slouching," it hissed, a plume of smoke escaping its nostrils. "We require additional pillows, preferably made of fire-resistant materials. Also, perhaps a small volcano-shaped footrest?" Head 2, seemingly the most sensitive of the bunch, wept openly about the dim lighting conditions in the break room, claiming it exacerbated their existing seasonal affective disorder. Sad, which apparently wasn't seasonal at all, but constant. The request for enhanced bioluminescent moss farming was, apparently, a non-negotiable demand. Head 6, ever the litigious one, demanded compensation for the emotional distress caused by its recent kidnapping. It insisted that the term kidnapped be formally recognized by Olympus Inc. as the legally appropriate term. Any attempts to use alternative phrasing such as borrowed would result in immediate legal action. The paperwork, Hercules knew, would be monstrous. Head 7, the interpretive dancer, launched into a passionate monologue about the lack of recognition for their artistic endeavors. It demanded a larger performance space, better lighting, and a personal costume designer. Furthermore, it needed a dedicated budget for its ongoing search for artistically relevant swamp reeds, which, it claimed, were integral to its creative process. Head 8, known for its baffling silence, suddenly spoke. It simply stated, "More napkins." Hercules rubbed his temples. This wasn't a simple matter of managing a budget. This was a full-blown existential crisis in the form of a multi-headed union grievance. He found himself oddly sympathizing with the head's demands, though. The paperwork, the lack of ergonomic support, the questionable lighting, it was all too familiar, all too real. Even a hero couldn't escape the petty tyrannies of corporate life. The meeting continued for hours, a tedious ballet of demands, counter-arguments, and exasperated sighs. Hercules proposed compromises: a slightly extended lunch break, the exploration of new swamp reed varieties with stringent budgetary controls, some improvements to the break room lighting, but no additional volcanic-themed amenities, and additional napkins for Head 8, whose sudden outburst was interpreted as a sign of existential angst. The negotiations were fraught with difficulty. Head 6 threatened legal action over the insufficient compensation for emotional distress. Head 7 launched into another interpretive dance routine to express its frustration, and Head 5 refused to participate in any discussions until it received its volcano-shaped footrest. The air grew thick with the combined scents of swamp reeds, nectarines, and brewing frustration. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, an agreement was reached. It involved a revised break schedule, a modest increase in the swamp reed budget, with a rigorous audit process, improved lighting, the official recognition of kidnapping as the legally correct terminology, and a limited trial period for the volcano-shaped footrest. Head 7 got its personal costume designer on a probationary basis. As Hercules emerged from the meeting, exhausted but triumphant, he felt a strange sense of accomplishment. He'd slain a hydra, yes, but he'd also negotiated a fair labor agreement for a band of disgruntled, fire-breathing, interpretive dancing, swamp reed-obsessed, sphinx-kidnapping monsters. And somewhere, deep within the bowels of Olympus Inc.'s HR department, a weary clerk likely muttered to themselves, "At least it wasn't another paperwork snafu." Hercules smiled. He understood. The battle may have been won, but the ceaseless war against bureaucracy, was far from over. The smell of faintly burning swamp reeds once again drifted in the air, The office day, he suspected, was just getting started. The Hydra's headcount headache had finally subsided, replaced by a new, equally formidable challenge: securing a contract with Cerberus, the three-headed canine gatekeeper of the underworld. Hercules, still smelling faintly of swamp reeds and slightly singed ambition, found himself standing before the imposing gates of Hades's realm. He'd expected fiery chasms and rivers of molten lava, but instead he was greeted by a surprisingly modern-looking building, a low-slung structure of polished obsidian with an understated sign reading Hades Inc. Contract Review Department. The sheer audacity of it all almost knocked him off his sandals. A contract review department in Hades? The irony was almost as pungent as the lingering scent of brimstone. He approached the reception desk, manned by a surprisingly cheerful imp with a clipboard and an overly enthusiastic smile. "Good morning, sir. Welcome to Hades Inc. My name is Fizwick. How can I assist you today?" Hercules, slightly bewildered, stammered, I'm here to see Cerberus. About a contract." Fizwick's smile widened. "Ah, yes, the Cerberus contract. A popular choice, always full of surprises. Please fill out these forms. Form 37B, Declaration of Intent to Contract with Canine Entities. Form 42A, Liability Waiver for Three-Headed Animals. And Form 999, Release of Liability for Soul-Related Incidents." He handed Hercules a stack of forms that seemed to rival the entire Library of Alexandria in both volume and complexity. Hercules groaned inwardly. He'd faced down monsters, navigated treacherous terrains, and endured the endless complaints of a hydra, but this was a whole new level of bureaucratic hell. The forms were filled with mind-numbing legal jargon, incomprehensible clauses, and spaces demanding specific details like Cerberus's preferred brand of kibble and his individual head's emotional availability for contract negotiation. The section on potential liabilities involving the accidental unleashing of infernal beasts was particularly concerning, especially since Hercules suspected he was barely qualified to walk a chihuahua, let alone a multi-headed hellhound. Hours passed in a blur of ink, frustration, and increasingly desperate attempts to decipher the legal mumbo-jumbo. Finally, with a sigh that could rival a hurricane, he managed to complete the forms. Fizwick, still inexplicably cheerful, whisked them away, promising to expedite the process, for a small expediting fee, of course, payable in platinum drachmas. The wait was agonizing. Hercules paced nervously, occasionally staring at a digital clock displaying a rather demonic countdown timer. Finally, a gruff voice announced, "Hercules, you may proceed." Cerberus, or rather his three heads, sat behind a large mahogany desk, each head sporting an identical pair of half-moon glasses. They looked less like fearsome beasts and more like disgruntled tax accountants on a particularly bad coffee day. "So, the paperwork," snarled the left head, a particularly snappy creature. "Is it all in order?" Hercules nodded, handing over the meticulously filled forms. The head scrutinized them with intense focus. For a tense moment, a deafening silence hung in the air, broken only by the occasional clicking of their three pens. "This liability waiver," the middle head grumbled, adjusting its glasses, "is insufficient. What about the clause regarding accidental soul swapping?" "It's covered in Section 3B, subparagraph 7.4, Hercules pointed out, his voice thick with exhaustion. "Ah, yes, but this point doesn't address the potential for spontaneous soul combustion during a full moon," the right head snapped, his tone unusually high-pitched. "We need additional assurances." Hercules wanted to pull his hair out. Dealing with this bureaucratic beast felt even more taxing than battling the actual hydra. The negotiations stretched into the night, a tedious dance of legal loopholes, counter-offers, and increasingly frantic attempts to appease three distinctly individualistic heads. They argued over the definition of acceptable kibble, debated the merits of different types of infernal insurance, and nearly came to blows over the placement of a specific comma in the contract's fine print. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, an agreement was reached. The contract, a document thicker than the combined works of Homer and Shakespeare, was signed, sealed, and delivered. Or rather, three heads diligently stamped their respective signatures with paws that surprisingly held surprisingly nimble pens. As Hercules emerged from Hades Inc., contract in hand, he couldn't help but feel a sense of profound exhaustion. He'd faced down monsters and negotiated with multi-headed dogs, and somehow the paperwork had proven to be the most daunting challenge of all. The journey to conquer the 12 labors, he realized, would be far less about brute strength and far more about endless piles of forms, bureaucratic snafus, and the sheer will to survive the overwhelming onslaught of corporate myth management. The faint scent of brimstone lingered in the air, a reminder that even in the underworld, bureaucracy reigned supreme. The final head was a surprisingly underwhelming affair. No dramatic flourish, no earth-shattering revelation, just a small, slightly dusty head tucked away behind a filing cabinet labeled Miscellaneous Mythological Appendages. Hercules had spent days meticulously combing through the hydra's lair, initially armed with nothing more than a clipboard and a rapidly deteriorating sense of hope. He'd employed every counting method imaginable, tally marks on a papyrus scroll that quickly became a tangled mess, elaborate spreadsheets created on a surprisingly sturdy, magically powered tablet, a gift from Athena naturally and still unpaid for, and even a complex abacus fashioned from the bones of particularly troublesome Gorgon sisters. The problem wasn't simply the sheer number of heads, but their chaotic nature. They regenerated at alarming rates, sprouted in unexpected places, and in one particularly frustrating incident, engaged in a spirited debate about the proper use of commas in a sonnet, written by one of them, a surprisingly gifted, if verbose, head. The entire process felt less like a heroic feat and more like a never-ending inventory audit in a particularly chaotic warehouse. He'd endured sarcastic whispers from the other Olympians, who seemed to find immense amusement in his struggles. Hermes, naturally, had placed bets on how long it would take, while Aphrodite offered unsolicited advice on head-counting strategies, often involving alluring perfumes and strategic deployment of charm. Even Zeus, normally preoccupied with more significant cosmic events, had been known to cast a weary glance Hercules' way. Their collective mirth only fueled Hercules' growing frustration. The bureaucratic nightmare, however, was surpassed only by the paperwork involved. Each head required its own individual documentation. Hercules was swamped in a sea of forms, each requiring detailed descriptions of the head's size, color, temperament, preferred diet, surprisingly diverse, ranging from soles to exceptionally rare cheese, and a detailed account of any notable scars or unusual birthmarks. There were also mandatory psychological evaluations, personality tests, and even a form asking about the head's political affiliations. It was enough to make even the most patient saint question their life choices. But after weeks of tireless work and countless cups of ambrosia-laced coffee, a divine stimulant that seemed to do little to alleviate the headaches, he had finally done it. He had accounted for every single head. The total, a seemingly insignificant number considering the chaos it had caused, was precisely 97. A figure so unremarkable it almost failed to register in Hercules' mind. The sense of accomplishment, however, was surprisingly underwhelming. There were no cheering crowds, no celebratory feasts, no triumphant cries echoing across Mount Olympus. Instead, he found himself standing in the impeccably organized HR department of Olympus Inc., a stark contrast to the chaos of the Hydra's lair. The department was a picture of sterile efficiency, chrome desks gleaming, paperwork meticulously filed, and an unnerving silence hanging in the air. A stern-looking nymph, whose name tag identified her as Penelope, head of Hydra headcount verification, barely looked up from her perfectly organized desk. "Ah, Hercules," she said, her voice as flat as a week-old pancake. "So, you've finally finished the head count. Please submit your report along with the required triplicate copies and ensure that Forms 7B, 12C, and the supplementary addendum regarding the atypical regeneration rate of head number 47 are properly completed. Oh, and don't forget to sign Section 8, Paragraph 3, Subsection C. We've recently updated the policy regarding the proper handling of recalcitrant Hydra heads." Hercules sighed. The victory felt less like a conquering of a monstrous beast, and more like completing an extremely tedious assignment. The sense of triumph was quickly replaced by the overwhelming urge to take a long nap. He felt as though he'd just completed a semester-long course in advanced mythological paperwork. He handed over his meticulously completed paperwork, feeling the weight of weeks of labor lift somewhat. Penelope barely glanced at the reports before stamping them with a flourish and handing him a single, official-looking form. "Congratulations, you've passed the headcount verification process," she said, her tone still as devoid of emotion as a marble statue. "Here is your performance review. Please rate your overall experience and provide feedback on the clarity and efficiency of our documentation processes." The form, predictably, was a multi-page monstrosity. Hercules stared at it, wondering if battling a multi-headed beast was easier than navigating Olympus Inc. SHR department. He briefly considered whether taking up pottery might be a more rewarding career path. At least clay didn't involve the agonizing need to complete triplicate forms regarding its proper firing temperature. As he walked away, Hercules couldn't help but muse on the true nature of his labors. Was it the monstrous Hydra itself, or the endless bureaucratic obstacles placed in his way that truly tested his strength and patience? The mountains of paperwork seemed to have taken a far greater toll than the actual battle. The Hydra's defeat felt almost anticlimactic, a mere footnote in the ongoing saga of his administrative battles. He found himself in a quiet corner of Olympus, reflecting on the absurdity of it all. He'd faced down Cerberus, negotiated with Hades, and even outsmarted a Sphinx with help from a well-placed bribe. Yet, the true enemy, the genuine challenge, seemed to be the relentless tide of paperwork, a never-ending river of forms and regulations that threatened to drown him in a sea of bureaucratic tedium. The epic battles were nothing compared to the quiet war waged against the endless flow of requests, approvals, and mandatory training sessions. Later that day, he stumbled upon Hermes, looking remarkably smug and holding a stack of scrolls taller than Hercules himself. "Heard about the head count," Hermes chirped. "I placed a bet on it taking longer, but frankly, you did well. It only cost you approximately 10 years of your life instead of the 20 I had predicted." He then slyly slipped Hercules a new form. "This one is for the reimbursement of the magical tablet used during the head count. Please ensure all supporting documentation is included. Also, we need a 5-page declaration outlining how the device was used and your level of proficiency." Hercules stared at the form. He suddenly wished he had chosen to fight another 1,000 hydras. At least then, the struggle would have been physical and less demoralizing. The thought of facing another form threatened to push him over the edge. He let out a sigh louder than the roar of any beast he'd faced, and began to fill out the form, resigning himself to the grim reality. The 12 labors weren't over, they were just getting started. The real fight was far from over. The administrative battle raged on, and it seemed Hercules was destined to be forever embroiled in its never-ending war. The faint scent of ambrosia and desperation hung heavy in the air. Chapter 4: The Apples of Discord, a Procurement Problem. The quest for the golden apples of Hesperides proved to be far more challenging than wrestling a 100-headed hydra or cleaning the Augean stables. Hercules, still reeling from the hydra head count debacle and the subsequent paperwork nightmare, found himself facing a new, equally daunting task: procurement. He needed golden apples, and obtaining them wasn't as simple as storming a garden and grabbing them. Oh no, this was Olympus, and procuring anything, even fruit, involved a level of bureaucratic complexity that would make even the most seasoned accountant weep. The process began with a request for proposals, or RFP as it was known in the divine procurement department. Hercules received a hefty packet that resembled a small encyclopedia. The document was printed on papyrus of such pristine quality it practically shimmered, embossed with the Olympian seal, a rather impressive eagle that seemed to be glaring judgmentally at him. Inside, however, lurked pages upon pages of excruciatingly detailed specifications, legalese that would make a lawyer blush, and an incomprehensible amount of technical jargon. The specifications for the apples themselves were particularly absurd. They had to be specifically golden, which was already vague, but then it specified golden of a specific shade of gold, with the chroma falling within the parameters of 75, 80 on the Olympian gold scale, and no more than 5% deviation in luminance. Hercules, a man of action, not color theory, stared blankly at this. What was an Olympian gold scale? Was there a paint chart in the heavens? Was this the equivalent of getting into a debate about the perfect shade of beige? Then came the section on apple provenance. The apples had to be ethically sourced from a tree recognized by the Divine Horticultural Society and not involving the exploitation or endangerment of any mythical nymphs or garden gnomes. This section included a mandatory questionnaire for the apple suppliers, requiring the submission of detailed information about the apple's family tree, ensuring that they weren't from a garden suspected of having tainted soil or a history of unorthodox pruning practices. The whole thing felt more like a background check for an interdimensional fruit than a simple procurement order. The next section, titled Delivery Specifications, detailed the exact dimensions of the crate, including tolerances for plus or minus 0.001 centimeters, the type of wood used, exclusively Olympus certified oak, and a list of acceptable adhesives and sealants. Each apple had to be individually wrapped in grade A ambrosia-infused fleece and packaged in accordance with the divine packaging protocols of 427 BC, Amendment 14. Hercules felt a migraine coming on. The deadline for submitting proposals was, of course, impossibly short. It seemed the gods worked to a different, much more demanding timetable than mere mortals. Hercules felt his heroic patience dwindling. This wasn't a labor. It was a full-time job, a soul-crushing administrative nightmare that would make the tasks of his past seem like a picnic. The meeting to open the proposals took place in a cavernous conference room on Mount Olympus. The air thrummed with the unspoken tension of the gods, and the sheer volume of paperwork piled on the mahogany table seemed to dwarf even the highest peaks. Zeus sat at the head, his expression one of weary impatience. Hermes fidgeted, occasionally whispering bets with Aphrodite, while the other gods looked on, clearly bored. One by one, the proposals were read aloud. They were a symphony of technical jargon, impressive charts, and mind-numbing details. The presentations ranged from overly formal, with PowerPoint presentations created by nervous-looking satyrs, to one hilariously inept attempt that involved a mime act. The satyr's proposal included a detailed analysis of soil pH, root systems, and a complicated chart showing the optimal position of the apple tree in relation to the sun, using a complex and probably made-up astrological formula. One of the proposals, submitted by a particularly flamboyant group of centaurs, had even included a 3D holographic model of their apple orchard, complete with miniature, shimmering apples. It was impressive, but the price tag was astronomical, which raised Zeus's already considerable eyebrows. The holographic centaurs, however, were quite good at negotiating, and after much haggling, managed to bring their exorbitant price down to a more reasonable, albeit still ridiculous, figure. A particularly strange submission arrived from a group of dryads who seemed to have decided that the written word was far too limiting for their proposals. They offered instead a song, a complex and oddly captivating ballad recounting the history of the apples, their unique properties, and their suitability for Herculean consumption, delivered in flawless harmony. The Dryad's unique presentation left the gods stunned into an unusual silence, and their rather charming yet disorganized proposal was duly noted. Then came the proposal from Hades's underworld supplier, a slightly unsettling character who seemed to specialize in ethically sourced, or at least that's what he claimed, items procured from somewhat questionable sources. His proposal was disturbingly brief, but strangely reassuring. He offered the apples at an extremely low price, claiming that this was his way of helping out a hero in a time of need. But Hercules could not ignore the slight sulfur smell coming from the proposal, even when he was holding it at arm's length. Hercules, meanwhile, felt like he was attending a highly specialized auction of exceptionally rare and precious fruit. The whole event felt utterly surreal and not at all heroic. It was the sort of bureaucratic nightmare that only the gods could create. The humor, of course, lay in the sheer absurdity of it all. A godlike hero reduced to navigating the labyrinthine corridors of divine procurement, battling not monsters, but spreadsheets, contracts, and the endless demands of official forms. After hours of presentations, counteroffers, and increasingly frustrated gods, Zeus finally slammed his gavel, bringing the proceedings to a close. The winning bid? A surprisingly reasonable offer from a group of rather ordinary-looking nymphs who somehow managed to fulfill every single criterion in the RFP, all with a startling degree of efficiency and politeness. Hercules had learned a valuable lesson. Even among the gods, efficiency reigned supreme, and sometimes the most effective strategy involved embracing the paperwork and adhering strictly to regulations. Though, even if he did learn that lesson, he couldn't shake the feeling that his true labor was not the acquisition of the golden apples, but the unending struggle to simply procure them. His true 12 labors were just beginning. The quest for the golden apples was officially over, but the battle with the bureaucratic beast had just begun its second round. The faint scent of ambrosia and desperation hung heavy in the air. The cavernous conference room, still echoing with the ghosts of the centaur's holographic orchard and the dryad's surprisingly catchy ballad, now buzzed with a different kind of energy, the low hum of bureaucratic inertia. The supplier selection committee, a gathering of Olympian heavyweights convened to scrutinize the proposals for the golden apples, had begun their deliberations. Zeus, looking less like the king of the gods and more like a weary executive reviewing quarterly reports, presided over the proceedings. Hermes, ever the mischievous messenger, had already managed to subtly alter the seating arrangement, placing Aphrodite strategically next to Ares, ensuring a constant low-level current of bickering that provided a steady distraction from the actual task at hand. Poseidon, as always, seemed preoccupied with the state of the oceans, occasionally muttering about rising tides and the alarming lack of respect for maritime boundaries displayed by some of the lesser sea deities. Hera, meanwhile, sat with an expression of supreme boredom, occasionally glancing at her perfectly manicured nails and sighing dramatically. She had already seen this play unfold 1,000 times before. Gods apparently were just as prone to endless meetings as mortals. The first item on the agenda was the proposal from the seemingly innocuous nymphs. Their bid, though remarkably efficient, was now subjected to the microscopic scrutiny of the committee. Each detail was dissected, each comma questioned, each word weighed with the gravity of 1,000 thunderbolt strikes. "The phrasing here," Hephaestus grumbled, his voice a low rumble that shook the already fragile papyrus, pointing a soot-stained finger at a particularly innocuous sentence. "Apples of exceptional quality." Exceptional to whom? By what standards? This is entirely subjective. He then launched into a lengthy explanation of his proposed rubric for objective apple quality assessment, involving a complex system of weights, measures, and a highly specialized apple testing device that seemed suspiciously similar to a miniature forge. His fellow committee members, politely and somewhat nervously, avoided eye contact. Aphrodite, distracted by a particularly flamboyant peacock that had somehow found its way into the conference room, chimed in with, "But the packaging, darling, it's just so understated. It lacks je ne sais quoi. I vote against it, unless they add a little sparkle." Her suggestion was met with a groan from the committee, including Zeus, who seemed genuinely tired of the lack of progress. Ares, meanwhile, focused on the security aspects of the nymph's proposal. What about the possibility of apple-based attacks? Have they considered the potential for apple-based weaponry? We need to think about the possibility of a sudden, unprovoked apple bombardment, he mused, stroking his beard pensively. He proceeded to outline a complex military strategy involving strategic apple deployment and the creation of a specialized apple defense force. Even the seemingly straightforward aspect of delivery became a point of contention. Poseidon raised concerns about the maritime shipping routes, arguing that the nymph's proposed sea route was inefficient and risked disrupting the natural currents. Hermes, ever the opportunist, suggested routing the shipment through his own courier service, at a substantial increase in cost, of course. The resulting argument between Poseidon and Hermes degenerated into a full-blown shouting match about ancient maritime law and the proper usage of winged sandals. The centaur's flamboyant presentation, while initially impressive, faced its own set of challenges. Their holographic apple orchard, while visually stunning, proved problematic for the committee. The sheer artistry of the miniature apples led to a lengthy debate about the validity of using technology in the procurement process. "Is this appropriate?" questioned Athena, her brow furrowed in intellectual concern. "Does the application of advanced technology somehow diminish the inherent value of the apples themselves?" The committee spent a considerable amount of time discussing the philosophical implications of holographic fruit, while the centaurs nervously fidgeted. The dryad's song, while charming, was deemed insufficient documentation for the formal procurement process. "While aesthetically pleasing," stated a rather pedantic Apollo, "it lacks the necessary quantitative data. How can we assess the apple's weight, circumference, and precise shade of gold from a ballad?" His observation set off another discussion on the appropriate formats for submitting proposals, delving into various forgotten Olympian regulations and ancient bureaucratic pronouncements. Hades's shadowy proposal, with its disturbingly low price and faint smell of sulfur, was quickly dismissed as too risky. Even Zeus, never one to back down from a challenge, deemed the proposition too problematic. Even for an Olympian-scale procurement operation, concerns were raised about the source of the apples, the quality of the associated paperwork, and whether or not they might start a spontaneous combustion upon entering the Olympian palace. After days of deliberation, debate, and an almost excessive amount of coffee nectar, supplied ironically by a small but highly efficient independent supplier that had somehow been overlooked in the original RFP, the committee finally reached a decision. The nymph's proposal, despite its initially understated appeal, had prevailed, but not before it faced an exhaustive review. The apples, however, still remained elusive. The acquisition of such a simple thing as fruit, now made into a monumental task, even for a hero of such stature as Hercules. The bureaucratic beast apparently was capable of outlasting the Nemean lion, the hydra, and even Cerberus. The quest for the golden apples had indeed ended, but Hercules' own labors were only just beginning. He was now a master of procurement, a champion of paperwork, a hero of endless forms. The journey, it seemed, was only just beginning. The air in the Hesperides orchard hung thick with the scent of citrus and apprehension. Hercules, clad not in his usual lion skin, but in a surprisingly ill-fitting suit, a gift apparently from Hermes, who found the whole hero-in-a-suit concept hysterically funny, shifted uncomfortably. Before him stood the three Hesperides, a trio of impossibly serene nymphs who seemed to radiate an aura of passive-aggressive compliance. "Right then," Hercules began, attempting a hearty tone that sounded more like a nervous cough. He clutched a hefty folder overflowing with documents, forms, permits, waivers, risk assessments, and an entire treatise on the ethical implications of apple harvesting. "We're here to, procure the golden apples." The eldest Hesperide, a woman whose serene expression suggested she'd seen centuries of paperwork, simply raised an eyebrow. "And you have all the necessary documentation?" Hercules paled slightly. "Yes, of course. I mean, mostly. There might be a few minor omissions." He shuffled through the papers, muttering about misplaced appendices and forgotten annexes. Minor omissions? The youngest Hesperide, whose expression was a masterpiece of understated disdain, tilted her head. "Such as?" Hercules hesitated. "Well, there's the matter of the environmental impact assessment. Turns out, picking golden apples from a magically self-sustaining orchard has some unforeseen consequences for the local ecosystem. Apparently it disrupts the delicate balance of something or other. I'm still working on the specifics." He offered a sheepish grin. The middle Hesperide, whose expression was a perfect blend of boredom and mild annoyance, sighed dramatically. "And the labor rights compliance forms?" Hercules's grin faltered. "Oh, right, those. Well, there was a slight oversight. You see, the apples don't technically work for us, so I wasn't entirely sure if the usual regulations applied. I've sent a query to Olympus. They're reviewing the case." Olympus? The eldest Hesperides' eyebrow rose even higher, if that was even possible. "And you expect us to wait for their decision before we release the apples?" "Hercules, my dear, this isn't a casual weekend jaunt. This is a highly regulated, strictly documented, legally complex transaction. Have you even considered the implications of the recent amendments to Decree 74B7 regarding the harvesting of unusually valuable fruits? Clause 37, subsection 2b specifically addresses situations involving, well, it's quite lengthy actually." Hercules stared blankly. I skimmed it." The Hesperides exchanged exasperated glances. The youngest Hesperidae produced a stack of documents even thicker than Hercules' own folder. This is merely the initial paperwork. Then comes the pre-harvest inspection, the post-harvest inventory, the chain of custody documentation, the quarterly compliance reports. She trailed off, clearly overwhelmed by the prospect of summarizing the endless forms. And the apples themselves must meet several stringent quality standards, the middle Hesperidae added. Specific metrics for ripeness, shine, and golden hue are outlined in Schedule K, Annex A. Any deviations will result in, well, let's just say it wouldn't be pleasant. Hercules felt a bead of sweat trickle down his temple. But they're golden apples. They're supposed to be, like, perfect. Perfect according to whom? The eldest Hesperidae snapped, her serenity finally cracking. According to our strict, rigorously applied, and utterly inflexible standards, naturally. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have a meeting with the auditors from the Department of Divine Produce Regulations. They're rather sticklers for detail, you see. Hercules, defeated and swamped in paperwork, felt a surge of sympathy for the other heroes who'd faced seemingly simple tasks that had become bureaucratic nightmares. The Nemean lion, the hydra, even Cerberus. They were mere trivialities compared to the formidable challenge of navigating the labyrinthine world of mythological compliance. He was a hero, yes, but he was also trapped in a perpetual cycle of forms, regulations, and the chillingly polite disapproval of 3 impossibly patient nymphs. He sighed, reaching for his pen. The quest for the golden apples was far from over. His quest for a moment of unadulterated joy, unburdened by compliance, had just begun. He suspected it would be as legendary in its own way. The next few hours were spent in a tedious exchange of increasingly complex forms. Hercules found himself arguing about the precise shade of golden, the acceptable level of shine, and the exact meaning of exceptional quality. He discovered that even mythical apples had to conform to strict regulations regarding weight, size, and the precise amount of sunlight they received during their growth. The Hesperides, it turned out, were not just guardians of the golden apples, but champions of red tape. They were experts in obscure regulations, masters of procedural minutiae, and connoisseurs of all things bureaucratic. They seemed to derive a strange sort of joy from dissecting every clause, every comma, every hyphen in the endless stream of documents Hercules presented. He learned of the complex permit required to harvest apples from a self-sustaining orchard, a lengthy application process that included an in-depth study of the orchard's soil composition, a detailed mapping of all the apple trees, and a 5-year environmental impact projection. He learned about the stringent safety regulations that govern the use of specialized apple picking equipment, the rigorous standards for apple packaging and transportation, and the numerous reports that had to be filed to ensure compliance with a variety of esoteric divine ordinances. Hercules, the slayer of monsters and the conqueror of beasts, was completely overwhelmed. He felt a deep, desperate longing for the simple days of hand-to-hand combat, a time before acronyms, annexes, and the soul-crushing weight of bureaucratic responsibility. He realized that while he could slay a lion, he couldn't even fill out a form without committing at least one egregious error. Eventually, after seemingly endless negotiations, compromises, and a considerable amount of groveling, Hercules managed to satisfy the Hesperides' exacting demands. He even managed to convince them that his query to Olympus was just a clever way to get the paperwork in order. They accepted his assurances with a thinly veiled sigh and a collective roll of their eyes. The golden apples finally secured were no longer merely symbols of temptation or discord. They were symbols of perseverance, hard work, and the incredible endurance required to navigate even the most seemingly straightforward task in the face of overwhelming bureaucracy. Hercules, the hero of 100 battles, had finally mastered the greatest challenge of them all, the triumph over compliance. The apples, however, still awaited their destination, and the journey, as always, seemed far from over. The next challenge, procuring approval from the Olympian Budget Committee, loomed ahead, a fearsome foe indeed. The conference room, once a scene of tense negotiations and near apocalyptic levels of paperwork, had settled into an unnerving calm. The air, previously thick with the scent of citrus and barely suppressed fury, now held only the faint aroma of old parchment and something vaguely resembling desperation. Hercules, slumped in a chair that seemed far too delicate for his considerable frame, stared blankly at the three Hesperides. They, in turn, were meticulously organizing the mountain of documentation that had accumulated during their epic paperwork battle. It looked like a particularly ambitious game of Jenga, constructed from forms, permits, and risk assessments. Each carefully filed document seemed to radiate an aura of quiet satisfaction, a silent testament to their bureaucratic prowess. Hercules, meanwhile, felt like a gladiator who'd just survived a brutal match, only to be presented with the tax forms. He'd conquered the bureaucratic hydra of compliance, but he felt as if he'd been simultaneously flayed alive and subjected to an extended seminar on ancient Greek accounting practices. He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair. The golden apples, 3 perfect orbs of shimmering gold, rested on a nearby table, looking oddly out of place amidst the official-looking folders and stamped documents. They seemed almost anticlimactic. After the monumental effort, the actual acquisition of the apples felt almost insignificant, a mere footnote in the epic saga of procurement. He'd faced down the Nemean lion with far less stress. The hydra's many heads were, comparatively, a walk in the park. Even Cerberus seemed positively cuddly in retrospect. "So," Hercules began, his voice hoarse from hours of strained negotiations, "that's it then? The apples are acquired?" The eldest Hesperide, whose serenity had finally returned to its pre-Hercules levels, nodded slowly. "Technically, yes. All necessary documentation has been completed, all regulations met, and all compliance standards achieved. The apples are yours to dispose of as you see fit, within the parameters outlined in Annex Z, subsection 4B, of course." She handed him a document so thick it could double as a small, surprisingly well-organized shield. The youngest Hesperide, her expression a picture of smug satisfaction, added, "We've also forwarded the completed documentation to the Department of Divine Produce Regulations, the Olympian Environmental Protection Agency, the Intermythic Trade Commission, and the committee that oversees the ethical implications of golden apple harvesting. You can expect follow-up audits within the next, let's just say several millennia." Hercules groaned internally. The sheer magnitude of this bureaucratic aftershock was almost as daunting as the procurement process itself. He'd conquered the paperwork, but the paperwork had clearly not conquered him. It had, however, left him feeling thoroughly depleted, a champion drained of energy and spirit, yet surrounded by the very trophies of his tedious victory. The middle Hesperide, ever the pragmatist, interrupted his gloomy thoughts. "We should probably discuss the transportation logistics. Schedule M, Appendix Q, details the approved methods of transporting exceptionally valuable fruits." She offered him yet another document, this one bound in what looked suspiciously like real gold leaf. Hercules stared at the seemingly endless stack of papers, feeling the familiar soul-crushing weight of bureaucratic expectation settling upon him. He realized that while he may have successfully navigated the complex world of divine regulations, he'd still have to contend with all the other complexities of the modern world. The logistics of transporting golden apples, it seemed, would prove to be just as challenging, if not more so, than their acquisition. The next several hours were devoted to discussions on transport permits, insurance regulations for extraordinarily valuable produce, and the optimal temperature for preserving the delicate golden hue of the apples during transit. Hercules found himself arguing the merits of using a winged chariot versus a divinely sanctioned courier service. He discovered that even the gods had to abide by stringent transportation regulations, and that the Olympian airline, notoriously understaffed and plagued by frequent delays, was not known for its punctuality, nor, for that matter, its understanding of the proper handling of precious fruit. He learned that there were specialized crates designed for transporting such fruits, each crate requiring a specific permit, and that the crates themselves had to meet strict safety standards. He also discovered that the specific routes to be taken had to be approved by the Council of the Winged Gods, who were notoriously difficult to please. The council, it seemed, was made up of many individual gods with their own sets of regulations, and even their own internal bureaucratic conflicts. Hercules' initial euphoria at acquiring the apples had long since evaporated, replaced by a profound sense of weariness. He realized to his chagrin that the process was far from over. He'd not only had to navigate the complicated acquisition of the apples, he now had to manage their safe delivery. The bureaucratic marathon had transitioned into a bureaucratic ultramarathon. He suspected that when he finally managed to deliver the golden apples to their rightful recipient, he would require several weeks of therapy, or at least a very strong drink. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the meticulously organized paperwork, Hercules finally managed to secure all the necessary permits and agreements. He found himself looking at the apples anew, no longer seeing them merely as golden fruit, but as emblems of his epic triumph over bureaucracy. The exhaustion was profound. He felt a deep, abiding sympathy for every office worker, every frustrated soul trapped in the labyrinth of administrative processes across the universe. He, Hercules, the hero of legends, had been reduced to a champion of compliance, and, even as he successfully concluded the transportation arrangements, he had to brace himself for the next monumental bureaucratic challenge, obtaining approval from the Olympian Budget Committee, where each application was scrutinized with a level of intense detail worthy of the three Hesperides themselves. The thought of it caused him to emit a groan that could be heard, perhaps, on Olympus itself. His odyssey wasn't over. It was simply entering a new, equally challenging phase. The golden apples, finally his, felt heavy with the weight of bureaucratic expectations. A new kind of labor for a new kind of hero. The 12 labors? That was child's play. This was the real trial. Hercules surveyed his newly organized home office with a mixture of pride and profound weariness. Gone were the days of chaotic piles of parchment and half-eaten hero sandwiches strewn across every surface. Now his workspace gleamed with the efficient, almost sterile order of a perfectly functioning, if slightly oversized, filing cabinet. Each document, meticulously labeled and color-coded, stood as a testament to his years of battling bureaucratic beasts. He'd conquered the Nemean lion's paperwork, outmaneuvered the hydra's many-headed forms, and even charmed Cerberus into approving his application for a specialized crate for transporting exceptionally valuable fruit. He'd become a master of the Olympian DMV. He picked up a gleaming, gold leaf-bound volume, his complete and utterly comprehensive retirement application. It was thicker than the complete works of Homer and almost as heavy. the sheer weight of it pressed down on his calloused hand, a tangible representation of his years spent navigating the labyrinthine corridors of divine bureaucracy. He chuckled, a low rumble in his chest. He'd faced down monsters, slain hydras, and cleaned Augean stables, tasks that paled in comparison to the Herculean effort of navigating the Olympian Department of Retirement Benefits. His retirement plan, a document of such complexity and detail that it could potentially launch 1,000 new bureaucratic nightmares, lay before him. He'd included everything, from his projected lifespan, allowing for potential interventions from the Department of Divine Longevity, to a detailed analysis of his contribution to the Olympian GDP, largely based on his contributions to pest control and his surprisingly lucrative side hustle as a freelance mythbuster. He even included a comprehensive risk assessment for the potential hazards associated with retirement, specifically the risk of encountering bored gods with petty administrative complaints. The application process itself had been an odyssey, requiring consultations with numerous obscure departments, each with its own peculiar set of regulations and often contradictory interpretations of the divine law. There was the Department of Heroic Contributions, whose officials seemed obsessed with evaluating the impact factor of his labors, an almost impossible task given the lack of a standardized measurement system for slaying mythological creatures. Then there was the Department of Divine Pensions, whose representatives had interrogated him relentlessly about the tax implications of capturing Cerberus. It turned out that Hades had a rather aggressive tax attorney, and, of course, there was the seemingly endless paperwork required for the transfer of his pension benefits from the Underworld Employee Benefit Trust. The process was made significantly more complex by the fact that the trust's official correspondence was frequently delivered by harpies. He sighed, remembering the countless hours spent filling out forms, navigating confusing online portals, and attending interminable meetings with seemingly immortal, yet utterly unhelpful bureaucrats. He'd learned the intricacies of the divine payroll system, understood the intricacies of intergod tax treaties, and mastered the art of negotiating with the notoriously capricious Olympian accounting department. He'd even developed a system for anticipating and preemptively addressing anticipated objections. He'd become fluent in the language of administrative legalese, a language far more baffling than any ancient tongue. He looked around at the perfectly arranged stacks of files, his documentation for completing the 12 labors. Each file represented not a heroic feat of strength, but a staggering victory over endless paperwork. The Nemean Lion's file, remarkably, was the thickest, thanks to the repeated requests for clarifications from the Department of Beast Control. The Hydra's file was slightly less voluminous, although it did include a significant number of forms related to the proper disposal of multiple-headed creatures. And the Augean Stables file? It was a testament to his abilities in organization, but was nearly lost within the filing system of the Department of Public Works. It had required multiple appeals, several follow-up audits, and more than a few divinely intervened miracles to reach its final form. He felt a pang of something akin to nostalgia. The struggles, the frustrations, the sheer absurdity of it all. It had been a uniquely challenging kind of hell. But it had been his hell, and somehow he'd conquered it. He'd turned bureaucratic obstacles into badges of honor, transforming administrative nightmares into epic tales of defiance. He'd become the ultimate office worker, a myth-busting, paperwork-slaying, form-filling, regulation-negotiating, compliance-championing titan of administrative achievement. He raised a hand, a tired but satisfied smile playing on his lips. "It's done," he muttered, placing the enormous retirement application neatly atop the already mountainous pile of perfectly organized paperwork. He picked up a half-eaten sandwich from the counter, slightly stale but still remarkably edible. He felt a sense of peace, a sense of completeness. He'd faced down monsters, conquered gods, and now, finally, he'd tamed the ultimate beast, bureaucracy. He took a bite of the sandwich, feeling the familiar yet satisfying crunch. Retirement awaited, and for once he felt prepared. Even better, he was ready for it to include minimal paperwork. He was confident that the next chapter of his life wouldn't involve quite so much paperwork, or at least that was his hope. He crossed his fingers, hoping the gods of retirement would agree. The thought of a sudden divine audit gave him pause. He probably should file a supplementary form just to be safe.